Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the second virtual retro seminar. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation. With me today is my co-host, Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, and our guest speaker, Iain Munro. Iain is Professor of Leadership and Organizational Change at Newcastle University Business School, and he's an expert on organization studies, information warfare in business, and business ethics. I'll turn the floor over to Iain in a moment, but before we start, I wanted to say a few words about the seminar. RETRO stands for Reputation, Ethics, Trust, and Relationships at Oxford. The seminar series is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. Before the coronavirus pandemic, RETRO was an Oxford-based series. Moving it online allowed us to include in the conversation many more people from around the world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome participants from the United Kingdom, France, Denmark, Spain, India, the United States, Nigeria, China, and several other countries. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank the people that made this possible. Rupert Younger, Director of the Center for Corporate Reputation, which is generously hosting this seminar series. Marie Watson, Chris Page, and Marquise Morgan, who have made the transition to the online format so much easier, and Alan, who's been guiding me from the very beginning. Today's seminar addresses important questions that directly speak to our center's mission. Iain is going to talk about transformations in network whistleblowing as counter-hegemony and moral leadership. Among other issues, his work discusses the different narratives that emerge around whistleblowing. People that denounce corruption and fraud are seen as insurgent moral heroes by some, and as criminals that threaten the social order by others. Whistleblowing, of course, can have tremendous impacts on the reputations of both the individuals that blow the whistle and the organizations whose wrongdoing is exposed. Iain will speak for around 30 minutes, during which time he will respond to clarification questions only. After that, we will have some time for Q&A. Please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and either Alan or I will relay them to Iain. You can find the Q&A button either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on the device that you're using. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. Iain, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rita and Alan. Thanks for inviting me to participate in your research seminar stream. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk about network whistleblowing, counter-hegemony, and moral leadership. And the agenda for my research presentation, I'm going to look at 3 recent trends in whistleblowing: the emergence of this thing called network whistleblowing, failures of whistleblower protections, and whistleblowing, counter-hegemony, and moral leadership, which is the broad underlying theme of the presentation as a whole. And whistleblowers can become quite famous individuals. Karen Silkwood whistleblowing on the nuclear industry, Jeffrey Wigand whistleblowing on the tobacco industry, Daniel Ellsberg whistleblowing about the lies spread in the Vietnam War and the misinformation related to the war. But these whistleblowers also can become part of a counter-hegemonic movement, part of an activist movement and a protest movement. And yeah, I'm going to have a look at how whistleblowers, to some extent, have sort of their role as activists, not only as whistleblowers, but also the massive transformations in how whistleblowing is practiced, which have developed over the last 10 or so years. So this idea of network whistleblowing, essentially it's technologically enabled, and it generally it increases protection for anonymity of whistleblowers. It facilitates mass leaking, so you can have very large quantities of information leaked to the journalists or a whistleblowing website. And it also has increasingly a global audience. So it's these aspects of whistleblowing, it's fundamentally transformed the sort of practice of whistleblowing. And new types of journalism have developed around this form of whistleblowing, most famously WikiLeaks, but also a number of new types of journalism, such as the Intercept online newspaper and the Panama Papers. I'll go into a few examples now. So really, the sort of pioneering platform in this field is WikiLeaks, which started in 2006. And possibly most famously, in 2010, WikiLeaks partnered with traditional media over the Chelsea Manning leaks. And of course, this had quite a lot of media exposure with The Guardian and New York Times and so on. And it had quite an effect on how the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were perceived, and there were some quite a lot of stories came out about the murder, widespread murder of civilians and journalists and so on in coming out of these leaks. And in fact, Julian Assange is currently in prison in Belmarsh in the UK, and the threat of extradition for working with Chelsea Manning about these leaks. So this is an ongoing issue. Then you've got Edward Snowden's leaks. He partnered with Glenn Greenwald, an independent journalist who also worked for The Guardian, Laura Pratris, a documentary filmmaker, and Iain Munro from The Guardian. And he flew to Hong Kong from Hawaii and was trying to get, as a contractor working for the National Security Agency, and was trying to get what he believed reliable expert journalists who would be sympathetic to release his very important story about the global mass surveillance, unconstitutional and illegal global mass surveillance being conducted by the National Security Agency. And again, there was some involvement with WikiLeaks, because when Snowden attempted to leave Hong Kong, he did so with the help of a local Canadian lawyer, human rights lawyer called Robert Thibault, but also Sarah Harrison, who is a journalist from WikiLeaks, who helped him escape from Hong Kong. And then you've got the Panama Papers, two journalists from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and working in collaboration with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And they don't know who the leaker is, but you have this massive transfer leak of files related to tax evasion in Panama, and a number of very important stories have come out about which have led to criminal investigation into tax evasion. There've also been I don't have on the screen there, but the Intercept, after the Edward Snowden leaks, Glenn Greenwald founded a new online journal called The Intercept, and they have also been pioneering new forms of whistleblowing journalism. They keep the Snowden archives, they maintain the Snowden archives, and they also have been involved in some very important work on leaks related to the damage done by drone strikes, civilian casualties, massive civilian casualties, and also Reality Winner, the whistleblower who blew the whistle on the alleged hacking of the American election in 2016. And more recently, there's also been some new form of network whistleblowing, partly related to an academic group called the Working Group on Syria Propaganda and Media. And there were there are now four whistleblowers from the OPCW who have questioned the findings of an attack in Douma and the gas attack. And this is an ongoing and controversial leak. However, lots of people have been involved in investigating these leaks. And I think the first director of the OPCW has actually called for an investigation into whether this, into how this incident was as it was investigated and reported. So network whistleblowing, there's lots of different types of network whistleblowing, and there are more open models where source documents are available. They attempt to encourage citizen journalism, so they encourage citizens and journalists to gain access to the original source documents, and or academics to pursue academic inquiries into the documents that are available, WikiLeaks being a classic example. But there are also more hybrid models working with traditional media where possibly the source documents might remain secret, or at a selective release of stories. That would be, for example, the Panama Papers and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. But there's all sorts of different types of, broadly speaking, network journalism and networked whistleblowing or whistleblower journalism. So moving on to my second theme, what happens to these whistleblowers? Well, a lot of these whistleblowers, not only the whistleblowers themselves, but also the people that work with the whistleblowers or are involved in journalism, whistleblowing journalism, have been subject to quite serious retaliatory measures. The pictures on the screen there, you've got John Kiriakou, who was the CIA whistleblower who revealed details of the lack of useful intelligence coming from the CIA torture program. And in fact, he's the only person to have ever served prison time for the US and UK's involvement in torture. And he was, of course, convicted for basically leaking or talking about it. He didn't really, as far as I'm aware, he didn't release any confidential information. Chelsea Manning famously was subject to 7 years in prison, including 7 years in prison, I think, a couple of years in solitary confinement, and the UN Special Rapporteur on torture determined that she had been subject to torture and massive human rights violations. And eventually she was pardoned by Barack Obama, but again was put back in prison again for refusing to testify to a grand jury about her leaks to WikiLeaks. Then you've got Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was assassinated whilst a journalist working on the Panama Papers in Malta. I believe her car was blown up. So, and finally, Julian Assange, arrested, confined, cut off from the internet, subject to smear campaigns, and now currently imprisoned in Belmarsh. Again, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, has determined that he should be immediately released, and he's been subject to torture. And a number of UN human rights lawyers have made similar comments about these whistleblowers and journalists who worked with whistleblowers and the desperate need to protect these people. So broadly speaking, we might conceive of silencing activities that whistleblowers and whistleblower supporters are subject to awful harassment. They can be, the GCHQ whistleblower Catherine Gunn during the Iraq War, her partner was threatened with extradition. Craig Murray, when he revealed the details of the UK's involvement in the torture program, again, during the Iraq War, I believe, his team in Uzbekistan, people he worked with, were subject to death threats and all sorts of nastiness. Edward Snowden, again, being the subject of numerous threats. Glenn Greenwald, the journalist who worked with Edward Snowden on the global mass surveillance leaks, his partner was subject to harassment by British authorities coming through Heathrow. Robert Thibault, Edward Snowden's first lawyer, has also been subject to for various forms of harassment, and John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower, was imprisoned. Nancy Hollander, who is the lead lawyer, defense lawyer for Chelsea Manning's appeal, talks about the criminalization of protest. This isn't simply, it is partly a silencing activity. You're trying to, these activities are intended to scare, to punish whistleblowers and to scare future whistleblowers who might speak out about corporate or government corruption and human rights violations, war crimes. But Nancy Hollander also believes this is part of a broader feature of recent sort of increasing authoritarianism in society, and the general criminalization of protest, that whistleblowing is a form of protest. And it's and increasingly harsh measures have been taken against whistleblowers and people who do speak out about corruption, and their supporters. Joachim Benkler talks about the need for protecting legal protection for accountability leaks, and he says that accountability leaks that expose systemic illegality, incompetence, error, or malfeasance, and challenge the system in ways that make leakers the target of heightened enforcement. So Benkler also sees that what he calls heightened enforcement, that we have whistleblower protections during the same time that we've had the development of new laws for increased whistleblower protection and various new technologies. We've also had an equivalent intensification of the harassment and prosecution and persecution of whistleblowers. So in Britain, for example, there's a lack of a public interest for national security whistleblowers, and same in the US. And there's also certain ambivalence about existing protections. Sometimes internal channels for whistleblower protection can themselves be misused. And before Edward Snowden blew the whistle on NSA global mass surveillance, Thomas Drake was a NSA whistleblower who attempted to go through internal channels, but ended up, I believe, going to prison and essentially being bankrupted. And going through internal channels didn't help him at all. Jesselyn Radack, an FBI whistleblower, talks about the current US Whistleblower Protection Act is a sham. And even recently, we had the UK All Parliamentary Group on Whistleblowing report in 2019, and it talked about it called for stronger protections for whistleblowers, and it criticised existing UK law for being opaque and too complex, and it called for the appointment of a whistleblower of last resort and various other things. But I found it strange also that it interviewed 400 people, but no mention is made of the imprisonment of Julian Assange, no mention of WikiLeaks, even though they're talking about the need for whistleblower protection. And this, there are strange omissions, even in more progressive aspects of our law and political movements. So now I'm going to move on to the third part of my talk today, and this is the idea of whistleblowing, counter-hegemony, and moral leadership. Whistleblowing can be part of a number of counter-hegemonic movements, and I'll talk a bit about a few of them. Most famously, perhaps, is the role of whistleblowing in anti-war activism. The godfather of whistleblowing, Daniel Ellsberg, I believe he was working for the Rand Corporation when he just determined that the politicians were routinely, senior politicians and the president were routinely lying about the reasons for the US involvement in the war, and also the way in which the war was being conducted. So he decided he was going to copy the so-called Pentagon Papers, photocopy them, and release them to the newspapers. And and part of this was he became an anti-war activist, and he became quite a major voice in the US anti-war movement. And this is not entirely, this is Catherine Gunn, who was a GCHQ whistleblower, who blew the whistle on an email from the NSA to the GCHQ, which talked about the manipulation, the need to survey United Nations diplomats in order to manipulate their vote in the UN to bring it to a pro-war outcome. She blew the whistle on this, and she again talks about subsequently about her commitment to anti-war activism and her involvement, very committed involvement in anti-war activism, which continues today. And Craig Murray the same. He blew the whistle, and also John Kiriakou on of our country's involvement in terrorism and in torture. And in the case of Craig Murray, for example, he was subject to a smear campaign and vindicated subsequently. And there were two inquiries, government inquiries into Britain's role in torture. And I think the last one was chaired by, I can't remember, but was published in 2018. And famously, the parliamentary group which was conducting the inquiry didn't get access to the people they wanted to interview. I think they only ended up being able to interview 3 people involved, and our then Prime Minister Theresa May refused for national security reasons. And John Kiriakou has written some very interesting books since he blew the whistle on torture. One about why he blew the whistle, and one about what happened to the person who some of the people he'd actually arrested. So he famously had arrested what they believed to be number 3 in Al Qaeda at the time. He was a CIA agent in Pakistan, and it turns out the person they arrested and tortured and waterboarded and did all sorts of terrible things wasn't a member of Al Qaeda after all. And they still refuse to admit this, but John Kiriakou has done some excellent work, a book called A Convenient Terrorist. And of course, Chelsea Manning and the collateral murder and her leaks. She's a very committed member of the anti-war movement in the United States. So it's not just about whistleblowing on single events. These people become part of a movement, part of a network, and the same happened with Daniel Ellsberg in Rand. Other examples here, well, WikiLeaks worked with a guy called Rudolf Elmore, who was a manager working for a Swiss bank. And he leaked details of tax evasion being done by the customers of the Swiss bank. And the networks that he originally approached would not support him, and he turned to WikiLeaks as a whistleblower of last resort, and WikiLeaks collaborated with him, and this became, the word got out. Perhaps a bigger and more impactful, even more impactful form of attack, a whistleblowing attack on financial power was when WikiLeaks had released details of political and financial corruption in Iceland during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And not only were people prosecuted as a result of these revelations, politicians and bankers, they were prosecuted, some went to prison, the government collapsed. And in fact, WikiLeaks was invited to help design a new constitution for Iceland, to create Iceland as an anti-secrecy haven instead of a secrecy haven. So it's not simply about just whistleblowing. It is a form of counter-hegemony. It's a form of it's part of a social movement. It's part of its moral leadership, bringing greater accountability to forms of power. And you can also see this in the work of counter-hegemony, not only anti-war, anti-imperial, attacking forms of financial power, but also holding politicians to account, and the media itself. Often whistleblowers have a very ambiguous or ambivalent relationship with the media because for various reasons, and whistleblowing journalists particularly, and quite often these partnerships between whistleblower journalists and mainstream media, whilst the mainstream may benefit massively from Pulitzer Prizes or great stories, boosted circulations, newspaper circulations, these relationships are often quite short-lived, and they may even turn against the whistleblowing journalists eventually, most notoriously in the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. But yeah, a lot of these whistleblowers are extremely courageous people. They've all more or less had their lives destroyed. And are they moral leaders? Well, I think they. My argument is yes, they're very much so. They're not moral leaders in the sense that perhaps that the mainstream literature on business ethics talks about. It describes moral leadership as normatively appropriate conduct, but in fact, it's often not clear what's normatively appropriate conduct. So we know that these whistleblowers and whistleblower journalists, they have their supporters, and they have their people who absolutely hate them and threaten them, lock them up and torture them. So what is normatively appropriate conduct? Well, what you have, I would argue, is these people are involved in a fundamental transformation of the system. And now they may believe, often they may believe they're simple reformists. I am trying to reform the system. Because what they've done is they've witnessed misconduct, human rights violations, or crimes against humanity. They've witnessed these things, and they are blowing the whistle in order to reform the system. But the system itself may respond by seeing them not as reformists, but by radicals. And the same action may be interpreted by the organizations that they were once members of as not being about reform, but about radicalism and the sort of a radical attack. And in fact, de la Gasnier talks about what this new form of whistleblowing, pioneered by people like Snowden, Assange, and Manning, aims at the heart of the juridico political system. Because it's not simply about identifying single instances of wrongdoing. It's about identifying systemic corruption, and it's about also providing new tools for revealing that corruption, for protecting whistleblowers, such as greater anonymity. So it seems to be seen as an attack on the system itself, and to some extent it is an attack on the system. So whistleblowing can be occasionally a form of counter-hegemony. Whistleblowers work with non-governmental organizations, whistleblower support networks, media outlets, lawyers, politicians, the UN Human Rights Council is involved. And it may be seen as a sort of part of a long-term war position. You may not get the original, you may not get what you're hoping for in terms of immediate reform, but it's part of a long-term project. So you get, let me think, there have been some reforms. Iceland, as I mentioned, a new government, a new constitution. Snowden, you've got ongoing mass surveillance, but there have been limited reforms. The US has banned bulk collection of telephone metadata in 2015. The UK Court of Appeal ruled in 2018 that parts of the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act needed to be revised. So there have been minor reforms. They can be seen as social enemies. Part of the Snowden leaks revealed hackers, whistleblowers, terrorists, and the internet all seen as all portrayed as social enemies, and they were surveying human rights groups like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and so on. Yeah. So, yeah, recently, I think earlier this year, 17 members of the German Bundestag Parliament nominated Assange, Manning, and Snowden for the Nobel Peace Prize. And in terms of the United Nations, seems to become increasingly concerned with the treatment of whistleblowers in the US and the UK, and the criminalization of journalism and whistleblowing. The Reporters Without Borders earlier this year downgraded the UK's sort of ranking in terms of freedom of the press as 35th in the world, which is lowest in Europe and one of the low, quite low for a democracy. So to finish, as moral leaders, you can understand whistleblowers as re-evaluators of values. They're not simply reformists. They may be reformists on some level, but they are engaged in a struggle over values, the struggle over and the revealing systemic corruption of financial power, military power, political power, and media power. And they're trying to create new institutions, overthrow to some extent an old corrupt regime. And to some extent, they speak not truth to power, but insurgent truths, which do, on some level, they may be asking for reform. On another level, the status quo interprets this as an insurgent truth, a challenge to the social order. And moral leaders, in fact, many moral leaders have been criminalized before, leaders of social movements, Martin Luther King and so on. So I would reinterpret some whistleblowers certainly as involved in a new form of moral leadership. That's my presentation in 30 minutes. And if you've got any questions, I'd be very interested to hear them.
Well, thank you very much, Iain. That was fascinating and very deep, and you covered a great deal of material in half an hour. So lots of scope for discussion, and there are some questions appearing on the Q&A in the Q&A window in front of me. So if you have questions out there, please type them in. I have one to start with, just trying to clarify conceptual terms. If whistleblowers serve a counter-hegemonic purpose, presumably that means, as you've indicated, that they're in some way challenging an understood and received status quo that supports existing power structures. But I wonder whether that's exactly the right way to interpret all of the examples you have. I mean, someone who wished to defend the status quo might say whistleblowers are there to protect what's good about the status quo. So when Iceland receives information from WikiLeaks, it prosecutes people, it welcomes WikiLeaks in, and essentially affirms something that perhaps Icelandic people thought they had before. And I wonder if there's an easy way to categorize whistleblowers who are acting to protect what's good in the status quo and whistleblowers who are acting to attempt dramatically to change the nature of the status quo. Is it just that people engaged in the latter activity get persecuted, or is there something else that we can use to distinguish between the two approaches?
Yeah,
about it?
I think that's a really important question. So I'm definitely lumping in a lot of people together who probably don't see themselves as being comparable, and I possibly taking some liberties there. I am writing about this currently, and certainly I would say some people see themselves, if you read their memoirs and so on, they tend to see themselves much more as reformists. However, I would say the system itself tends to see them as insurgents, even if we assume we're living in a healthy democratic system, then they would be reformists, if you follow what I mean. But in fact, if we're not living in such a healthy and democratic system, then perhaps you'll have different interpretations, of course, depending on whichever journalist, politician, or whatever you ask about any particular whistleblower. But yeah, I think that even if they see themselves as reformists, often the way they're treated is quite harsh. And part of the reason is because certainly recently with the network whistleblowing, I think what we've seen is there's a lot more systemic corruption that we previously only we had a small insight into, whereas now we have a much greater appreciation of just how deep-rooted many of these problems are concerning, say, tax evasion, war crimes, and so on, which you don't see if you read The Economist. No offense to, you don't get that side of it. Or if you watch, say, CNN's version of, say, the Iraq War, it's very different from what you get if you have a look at the Iraq war logs. Very different. And yeah, I'm sorry, that's probably too long. It's a very good question. I definitely have to think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Iain. We have a question here from John Weezy, actually 2 questions. The first one is, so John would like to know what your view is on whether Snowden and others like him achieved what they set out to achieve. And then the second question is, while these actions may be noble, there's a question here about whether it put the world in a more insecure position now than before whistleblowers started acting like this, blowing the whistle.
Did he achieve, well, in the lecture slides, you can see that he achieved some minor reforms to the US law and to the UK, but only minor. So I don't think, now the best thing to do, I would recommend, there's a very good book. All proceeds go to the US government, none to Mr. Snowden, unfortunately. But it's an excellent book, and he answers that question in that book. But basically, no, he's still working hard to try and get some greater democratic oversight over what happens behind closed doors in our intelligence agencies, and the kind of tools and techniques that they're using against possibly legitimate targets in many cases, but questionable. If you read the book, you'll see that they are surveying girlfriends, family members. I mean, Angela Merkel had to got an apology from Barack Obama. You've got all sorts of very peculiar things going on. And I have little doubt they're still going on, but there have been some minor reforms. In terms of making the world more unstable, the world is certainly. I don't think. I'm not sure whether. I think if we've made some terrible foreign policy decisions over the last few years, and also financial institutions have made some terrible and corrupt decisions. I don't think the whistleblowers are responsible for the instability in the financial system, or the instability, for example, in say the Middle East, for example. No, I would say no. Now, on some level, there is perhaps we need more instability in terms of the way in which we're taking things for granted. Yeah, I don't know. Second question is a very difficult question. First question, only limited reform.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions here that are related, so I'm going to take them together. One from Annette Nikes, who's at the Business School in Oxford, and another one from Mark Elliott. Both of them are asking something about corporate whistleblowing. So Annette makes the point that corporate whistleblowing is predicated on the idea that whistleblowers can work within the system and help to reform it. So laws, the rule of law, such as it is in that context, is designed to kind of protect some vision of the firm, which is related to the first question that we were talking about. And she'd like to understand how one determines at what point whistleblowing working within the system turns into insurgents. How do we know when we're seeing insurgents and not just seeing counter-hegemonic behavior. Mark asked a similar question. Do you see counter-hegemonic behavior arising in the world of corporate business as businesses become more powerful, more international? Is there greater concern for hegemony being exercised by corporations?
Yeah, I think that's a really good, great question. So I would say, well, Fred Alford has a great book. I think it's just called Whistleblowers. And in it, he says whistleblowing is essentially defined by the level of retaliation taken against the whistleblower. So you can sort of, you can gauge how counter-hegemonic, whether the hegemonic the whistleblower is by the reaction of the system, as it were, of the corporation or of government. And if it's, for example, in the case of, you know, if a whistleblower is having to live abroad or is murdered or is in prison, then you can, and has had their life ruined, then you can see probably they were seen as quite a serious threat. Yeah, if there are gross human rights violations being perpetrated against the whistleblower by the government or by the company, I mean,
it's easier for governments to perpetrate human rights abuses. We have an anonymous question asking how they get away with that and how they do it. I presume it's much harder for a corporation to violate human rights in a fundamental way, or is it not?
That's a good question. Well, in the Snowden case, because Snowden wasn't a government employee directly, he worked for Booz Allen Hamilton and Dell, and it depends on the government. But a lot of even government whistleblowers, as it were, are not, you know, often working for big private corporations. Can corporations get away with it? Well, I don't think, of course, they don't have, the big corporations have just the same resources, lawyers and money. And, you know, there's a lot of interesting work, in fact, being done on the role of private intelligence companies as well. When you think of, there are a whole bunch of private intelligence companies like Hacking Team, and there's I think it's called NSO, and a whole bunch of other organizations that are basically, there was one called HB Gary, which was hired by, I believe it was an American bank, I won't name it, just in case I get it wrong. And they hired HB Gary to essentially destroy WikiLeaks. And Anonymous got whiff of what was going on, and they decided to, there's a great book by Gabriella Coleman about this, and they decided to take down HB Gary, and they did. There's all sorts of things going on, dirty tricks, of course, being conducted by big corporations that aren't so different, and are basically employing the same tools in the same organizations as governments. Certainly, it gets into the information warfare territory, which I'm also very interested in researching. Yeah, I think I've half answered that question, if that's okay.
We have a couple of questions here about whistleblower protection. So Guy Huber, for instance, is asking if we should create greater conditions for anonymity of whistleblowers, and if that would be an important part of their protection. But Caroline actually wonders if the term whistleblower is helpful or not, because it immediately places the focus on the individual instead of the story, and so begins to facilitate persecution or the undermining of the individual.
Excellent, both excellent questions. I believe there was a change to the British law recently where if a whistleblower or leaker was being prosecuted, their character couldn't be used as part of the prosecution. It had to be the act. But in terms of increased anonymity, I think this is certainly happening, and that is, I mean, this has pros and cons, of course, because you don't know, it becomes increasingly, of course, it's very difficult to verify the quality of the data. Should it matter who's leaking? I think really not. If someone from another country is revealing corruption and human rights violations being conducted by your own companies and own politicians, does it really matter? Some people really get obsessed by this. I think they're ones who are very much part of the problem in the prosecution of whistleblowers and whistleblower lawyers and journalists. That's my opinion. But yeah, I would say greater anonymity. Of course, it becomes very difficult to determine whether documents are real documents and stuff like that. But that's also part of normal journalism anyway.
How about Caroline's point about the term whistleblower itself?
Yeah. Well, if they're anonymous, then it's not an issue because you don't know. But I think whistleblower protection laws is absolutely essential. And of course, there is this all-party parliamentary group that have produced a report on this in the UK, and they are calling for stronger protections of whistleblowers and whistleblower protections, and more clarity and simplicity in the UK law. And trying to things concerning things like the use of non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that shouldn't be allowed. I mean, I believe it's not allowed anyway with the existing Public Interest Disclosure Act. I don't know. But yeah, I think the whistleblower protection laws are very important, and then the issue is someone legally defined as a whistleblower or not, in order to get the necessary protections. And off the top of my head, I'm afraid I can't give a clear answer on that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you.
So Mariana Futaki's asked a couple of questions that are related to each other and related to what you've just said. So the term whistleblowing suggests that when one whistleblows is highlighting a failure to comply with some sort of norm. It might be a universal human rights norm, or it might simply be a failure to comply with a promise that you already made. So I think one way to interpret Mariana's question, which I'm about to read out to you, is to ask whether whistleblowing sometimes simply points out that organizations which are whistleblown against are failing to live up to their expressed purpose. So the CIA was not set up to spy on its own citizens. And maybe what whistleblowers are helping doing is simply bringing organizations and institutions back to their original purpose. They're a governance device that facilitates, promise keeping. And she'd like to know if you agree with that characterization of whistleblowing.
So an original interest in whistleblowing broadly would agree with that characterization. I am very much concerned with the human rights aspect, because a lot of whistleblowing relates to issues such as the right to life, the right to privacy, basic human rights. And whistleblowers raise concerns about the violation of basic human rights. And that is absolutely, these are all norms that we should hold dear now, and how should have been enforcing since at least 1948 and the foundation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at least. Now, these are, of course, espoused norms. Whether we've ever actually lived up to those norms is another question. So I think there's a sort of assumption that we have lived up to those norms, and I think that we've not. In Britain, we had internment, of course, during the Troubles, so-called, in Ireland, where people were arrested without, trials and so on. There weren't, due process and all sorts of stuff. Whether we've ever really followed these things, well, history's littered with governments violating the rights of various parts of their citizenry. Same with corporations, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, you could see it as reform. You could see it as an ongoing struggle, where the senses of power, which are only becoming more powerful. I mean, financial power is only becoming more concentrated. Technological power is vast now, if you look at the power of these IT giants. And yeah, I mean, military power is just, well, it's not getting, we're not spending less on arms now than we ever have done. If you look at the expenditure in arms, expenditure on intelligence, expenditure on all these things, oil even, apart from till COVID, obviously. But no, I think these centers of power are getting ever stronger, and they are reacting viscerally to justified challenges to their power, which have been recently quite revealing because of this very powerful new technology that's being used to network whistleblowing. Now, of course, the human aspect, a very famous journalist called Duncan Campbell strongly disagreed with me at a recent workshop and said it's really about human. It's more about the people than it is about the technology. And I have to say, it's a part of my presentation that I completely underplay. And I agree with him. He's right. Technology is, but technology has allowed for a new type of whistleblowing, nevertheless, and it is threatening to the structures of power. And I think to that extent, a bit of both is a short answer to Marianne's question.
Thank you, Iain. We have two questions here from Shibo Q. One of them is about culture. So different cultures might make different evaluations of the conduct of whistleblowers. Some might see whistleblowers as heroes, others might see whistleblowing as more of a negative act. And Shibo is asking what role culture plays there, and also if there is a concept like responsible whistleblowing, and if people overuse their right to blow the whistle, and what institutions can do to prevent irresponsible whistleblowing from happening.
Yeah, the public interest whistleblowing, I would define responsible whistleblowing as public interest whistleblowing, very, very simply. If it's in the public interest, if a human rights violation or a harm is being perpetrated by an organization on a person or many people, then public interest offense, absolutely, that's responsible whistleblowing. Otherwise, yeah, I guess gossip or denunciation is not necessarily whistleblowing, although, yeah, but public interest whistleblowing, absolutely. I think it's fairly, there's quite a bit of literature on this already. Certainly that not all speaking up about what you happen to be upset about should be interpreted as whistleblowing. The people I'm referring to in my presentation, though, I think it's fairly clear it's public interest whistleblowing. And now, of course, their responsible process, how do you go about doing it? It's actually quite difficult because there's lots of good advice. The Government Accountability Project gives very good advice on this type of stuff, steps you should take. But yeah, internally, well, maybe, but you can still get stuffed. A number of corporate banking whistleblowers, Kate Kenny's book on whistleblowing in the finance industry is absolutely fantastic. Gives an absolutely fantastic account of some people who were in quite senior positions who tried to blow the whistle on very bad decisions being taken by the banks, and they got sacked and they got prosecuted, and all sorts of things happened to them. So it can be a risk going internally. And yeah, and Edward Snowden, of course, after Thomas Drake decided he raised some issues internally, but eventually may have to go externally. But yeah, Government Accountability Project does provide excellent advice on sort of basic questions to ask. Talk to a lawyer is a very important first basic step.
Because that takes us to a question that we have here from Andrew Lee. Andrew was asking whether there are structured and regulated means through which whistleblowers can raise their concerns around human rights violations, or if they have to make their voices heard through other informal, non-legal channels.
Yeah, I think most organizations have anonymous channels for whistleblowing, certainly in Europe. There's some really good work being done on Up Speaking by Marianne Fataki and Kate Kenny, and I think his name is Vin van der Kove. on the role of internal whistleblowing channels, formalized whistleblowing channels. And yeah, so I think certainly many organizations provide these channels. You would have to make very certain that if you want to remain anonymous, that the whistleblowing channel you're using is anonymous, and you can't be spied on by a member of a corporate hierarchy. But yeah, the talking to the press is obviously can be dangerous, and you want to be very careful about how you do it. Government accountability project, it's very good on that sort of stuff. But yeah, the work being done by Mariana Fataki, Kate Kenny on upspeaking internal whistleblowing channels is well worth having a look at.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've probably got time for one more question. And it comes from Tom Lawrence, who's based in Oxford and has found a clever way of asking a question that's been niggling at the edges of my understanding throughout the hour. One person's whistleblower is heroic whistleblower is another person's troublemaker, right? So it's impossible to theorize about this sort of thing without adopting a normative stance. And of course, if what you're whistleblowing on is torture, the normative stance is easy to arrive at. But in other cases, it might be hard critically to evaluate what's going on. And Tom asks whether you could say something about the role of academics in this context. So how do we study whistleblowing from a position that's critical, both in relation to organizations and states that are accused of problematic behavior, and also of the actors who are either deemed or who self-identify as whistleblowers? How do we steer a line through this very tangled ethical evaluative jungle?
That's a really good question. And hello, Tom. That is a really good question. So I essentially agree with the point being made by Tom in the first instance, that in some cases it's crystal clear, such as torture. And in some cases it's less clear. And then how do we, and I also would agree that it's very difficult to, I'm not, in my own opinion, the idea of value neutral research is not an unattainable idea, but an undesirable idea. And that, especially in an era in which we see increasing authoritarianism, increasing human rights violations and all sorts of things going on. I think there is this idea of the public intellectual that various, Edward Saïd famously gave a talk on, I think at Oxford sometime in 1990s, and on issues such as, on very important issues such as human rights, you need to speak out. It's not just enough to study it. You have to say that's wrong. Now there may be issues where it's less clear. That is something where you have to talk with your colleagues. You have to get advice from people who know the particulars of the case. And yeah, there may be difficult decisions to make, certainly. Whistleblowers are often, that they are in a very difficult situation, and I don't think it's the role of an academic just to sit by and sort of live off it, as it were. There has to be a bit more of a sincere engagement with what they're involved in. But yeah, it's essentially, yeah, Tom's right. It does depend. There are some cases which cut and dry. There are other cases where it's less clear, and that's down to the individual. But talk to your colleagues.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I just want to finish by saying thank you again, Iain. This was a fascinating talk. Thank you to all of the participants. Thank you for all the questions. And just a little bit of advertising. Our next seminar is going to be with Steen Valentin. We are going to be placing links to the registration page on social media and also on the Center for Corporate Reputation's website. So please do register, join us for the next one. Thank you and have a good evening.